The Franks, from Germanic warriors to heirs of Rome. Our journey begins in the twilight of the Roman world, where a new power was coalescing in the forests and marshes of northern Europe. These were the Franks, a Germanic confederation that would rise from obscurity to forge the dominant empire of early medieval Western Europe. Their story is one of migration, military might, religious transformation, and the birth of kingdoms that would eventually become France and Germany. The origins of the Franks, like those of many ancient peoples, are shrouded in a fascinating blend of history and mythology. Early medieval writers spun grand tales to give their tribe a prestigious past. The 6th century historian Gregory of Tours offered a more grounded, though still speculative, account, suggesting the Franks originated in Pannonia, roughly modern-day Hungary, before settling along the Rhine and moving through Thuringia. However, a far more fantastic legend appears in the 7th century Chronicle of Fredegar, which audaciously claimed the Franks were descendants of the Trojan heroes of Virgil's epics. This narrative described a post-Trojan War migration led by figures named Priam and Francio, who journeyed from Asia to Macedonia and finally to the Rhine, where they dreamt of building a new Troy. The 8th century Liber Historiae Francorum echoes this, adding that after aiding the Romans in military campaigns, the group earned the name Franks, a title implying their fierceness in battle. Modern historians view these myths with skepticism, seeing them as a deliberate effort to construct a noble lineage for what likely was a relatively young and dynamic confederation of smaller tribes. This act of historical revisionism is itself a testament to the human need for a storied past. The first concrete historical mentions of the Franks place them in the late 3rd century A.D., interacting with the Roman Empire in both hostile and cooperative ways. Roman sources, like the Panegyrici Latini and the works of Ammianius Marcellinus, describe various Frankish subgroups, the Chamavi, Bructeri, Chatti, Salians, Ripararians, and Ampsivarii, appearing on the imperial frontier. They were initially seen as raiders, with one group famously reaching as far as Tarragona in Spain around 260 A.D., causing chaos until Roman forces pushed them back a decade later. By the end of the 3rd century, Emperor Maximian adopted a more aggressive policy, subduing the Salian Franks around 288 A.D. and employing a common Roman strategy, relocating them within the empire's borders. This strategic resettlement, recorded by the biographer Eutropius, reflects Rome's broader policy of barbarian management through forced or negotiated relocation. The Tabula Peutingeriana, a medieval copy of a Roman road map, marks Frankish settlements along the Rhine, including a region labeled Francia. The Salian Franks, in particular, played a foundational role. After being allowed to settle as foederati, allied federates, in Toxandria, roughly modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands, following Emperor Julian's campaigns in 358 A.D., they began their expansion. By the 5th century, they were exerting control over the river Scheldt, disrupting trade and showcasing their growing power. Their southward push into modern-day France is synonymous with the rise of the Merovingian dynasty, famously associated with the Lex Salica, Salian law. A key geographical boundary was the Silva Carbonaria, or the charcoal forest, which the Salians crossed under leaders like Clodio, extending their influence into areas such as Tournai, Artois, Cambrai, and the Somme region. Clodio's legacy, as recounted by Gregory of Tours, positioned him as an ancestor to the Merovingian kings, with his successor Childeric I and his son Clovis I, expanding and consolidating Frankish rule. Childeric collaborated with Roman forces, reflecting the complex interdependence of the era, and his activities laid the groundwork for the Frankish kingdom of Neustria, the heartland of later medieval France. Clovis's reign would unify the Frankish tribes and push east past the Silva Carbonaria into Belgica, establishing the foundations for the Kingdom of Austrasia, which later adopted the Lex Ripuaria, a distinct legal code. The Franks of the Rhineland, often called Ripuarians in modern scholarship, occupied a crucial stretch from Mainz to Duisburg, including the area around Cologne. The term Ripuarian likely derives from ripa, Latin for riverbank, meaning river people. The distinction between Salian and Ripuarian Franks, while useful, likely reflects political and regional differentiations within a broader Frankish identity, rather than rigid tribal divisions. The Ripuarian territories became integral to the Merovingian kingdom of Austrasia, which encompassed not only Salian and Ripuarian areas, but also parts of Roman Germania and Gallia Belgica, evolving to include much of medieval Lotharingia. The mid-5th century saw the Merovingian dynasty emerge as a dominant force, leveraging its connections with Roman military structures. Childeric I served as a Roman military commander in Gaul, representing a new form of leadership. After his death, around 464-465 AD, his son Clovis expanded their influence, achieving stunning victories. These included the defeat of the Roman ruler Sigrius at the Battle of Soissons, 486-487 AD, and the subjugation of other Frankish kings. By 509 AD, Clovis had vanquished the Ripuarian Franks and established Paris as his capital, becoming the first king to rule over all the Frankish tribes. His realm was further expanded by victories over the Visigoths at the Battle of Vouillé and the eventual integration of Burgundy, Provence, and Brittany. Following Frankish custom, Clovis's death led to the division of his kingdom among his 4 sons. They managed to maintain a unified front long enough to conquer Burgundy in 534 AD, but subsequent generations were torn apart by intense rivalries, particularly between the queens Brunhilda and Fredegund. These conflicts led to the formation of 3 distinct sub-kingdoms, Austrasia, Neustria, and Burgundy. The political center gradually shifted eastward to the Rhineland due to the influence of the Arnulfing clan in Austrasia. The realm was reunified under Clothar II in 613 AD, who issued the Edict of Paris to strengthen royal authority. His son, Dagobert I, marked the zenith of the Merovingian power, which then declined under a series of ineffective kings known as the Rois Fainéants, do-nothing kings. The final shift in power came when Pepin the Short, a mayor of the palace, deposed the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, in 751 AD, with the support of the church and aristocracy. This ushered in the Carolingian dynasty and a new chapter in Frankish history, culminating in the Carolingian Empire. The empire's division after the death of Louis the Pious was formalized by the Treaty of Verdun in 843 AD, which partitioned the realm among his 3 surviving sons. This division mirrored deep dynastic, cultural, and religious tensions. Lothar I received the Middle Kingdom, a long, vulnerable strip of land, including parts of modern-day Italy, the Low Countries, and the Rhineland. Charles the Bald was granted West Francia, which would evolve into France, and Louis the German received East Francia, the core of the future Holy Roman Empire. This tripartite split led to political fragmentation and endless border conflicts. The lack of a strong central authority enabled the local rise of feudal lords, who often held more actual power than the kings. As each region developed independently, distinct cultural, social, and linguistic identities began to form, with vernacular languages eclipsing Latin. Now, let's delve into specific aspects of Carolingian culture, language, religion, and military. The Old Frankish language, or Old Franconian, was spoken before the High German consonant shift, 6th to 7th centuries AD. This shift caused a divergence. Dialects that would become Dutch did not experience the shift, while others did. Consequently, the distinction between Old Dutch and Old Frankish is minimal, with Old Dutch often used for post-shift variations. Direct evidence of Old Frankish is scarce, limited to a few runic inscriptions, like the Bergacher inscription. However, much has been reconstructed through early German loanwords in Old French and comparative linguistics, particularly through Dutch. Frankish influence on contemporary vocabulary is significant, including the words for the cardinal directions north, south, east, and west, and an estimated 1,000 other words.
Culturally and artistically, early Frankish contributions fall within the migration period art style, transitioning into Carolingian art and pre-Romanesque architecture. Surviving Merovingian architecture is rare, with most early churches likely built of timber. The best preserved example is a baptistery in Poitiers, reflecting a Gallo-Roman style. Artifacts like the grave goods of Queen Aragonde and the treasure of Gourdon showcase the artistry of the period, though the surviving works may not fully represent the era's quality. The Carolingian Renaissance, heavily influenced by Charlemagne's patronage, marked a significant cultural transformation. Carolingian art and architecture, such as the Palatine Chapel in Aachen, demonstrate a confident adaptation of Byzantine influences and a sophistication that set the stage for future Western art. The conversion of the Frankish elite to Christianity happened relatively quickly after Clovis, but converting the entire population was a much longer process. Frankish paganism shared traits with broader Germanic paganism, being highly ritualistic and centered on localized deities. The pivotal moment came with Clovis's conversion to Catholicism in 496 AD, after his marriage to the Burgundian Catholic princess Clotilda, and a decisive military victory he attributed to divine intervention. This event led to the baptism of Clovis and thousands of his warriors, aligning the Frankish kingdom with the Catholic Church, unlike other Germanic tribes, which were largely Arian. Clovis's conversion facilitated a smoother relationship between the Church and the Frankish state, which was crucial for the spread of Christianity in Western Europe. Despite the elite's swift conversion, the complete Christianization of the populace took centuries, facing considerable resistance. Merovingian church leaders had to integrate with the existing Gallo-Roman ecclesiastical structure, Christianize pagan customs, and define a new theological foundation for a kingship that had pagan roots. Monasticism flourished, endorsed by Merovingian wealth and waves of hermetism, eventually leading to the widespread adoption of the Benedictine rule. The relationship between the Church and the Merovingian kings was often strained, particularly as kings sometimes displayed pagan practices like polygamy. The eventual rise of the Carolingian mayors of the palace, crowned by the Pope, marked a significant realignment towards a more stable government under a Christian emperor. The Frankish legal system was originally based on oral traditions, with laws memorized and recited by officials known as Rotchimburgs. By the 6th century, these laws began to be recorded, most famously in the Lex Salica, Salic law, for the Salian Franks, and the Lex Ripuaria, for the Ripuarians. Gallo-Romans and the clergy continued to be governed by traditional Roman law, indicating a coexistence of legal principles. Frankish law focused primarily on individual rights and personal justice, emphasizing the resolution of disputes at a personal level, with meticulous attention paid to cases involving personal property or injury. This contrasted with the more state-centric Roman legal system and underscores a societal framework where personal honor and community standing were paramount. The Frankish military history is deeply intertwined with that of Rome. Germanic participation in the Roman army dated back to Julius Caesar, but their role became increasingly prominent after the collapse of Roman authority in Gaul. Frankish commanders like Magnentius, Silvanus, Ricimer, and Bauto held high positions in the Roman military. Ammanus Marcellinus's accounts provide insights into how tribes like the Franks adopted Roman military organization and tactics, resulting in a fusion of Roman discipline with Germanic warrior culture. This blend continued to evolve, and the 6th century scholar Procopius noted that the Heruli, having assimilated with the Franks, retained their Roman legionary organization long after the fall of the Western Empire. Under the Merovingians, the Franks melded their customs with these Romanized structures. Procopius depicts the Franks as a predominantly infantry force, armed with axes, swords, and shields, and disdainful of the spear or bow. Their preferred tactic was the throwing axe, the Francisca, which could shatter enemy shields and wreak havoc. Agathias corroborates, noting their disdain for body armor, valuing mobility and shock over protection. However, these Byzantine sources contradict each other and don't always align with archaeological finds or the works of Sidonius Apollinaris and Gregory of Tours. These latter sources, along with the Lex Ripuaria, provide evidence of a more diversified Frankish military that used spears, helmets, and mail armor, suggesting a more complex force. The Merovingian military, deeply rooted in Roman tradition, adapted and evolved to form a unique, pragmatic, and versatile approach to warfare. This adaptability was crucial for both defense and expansion. The militarized society was evident in the martial field, an annual assembly for planning campaigns, displaying royal power, and affirming noble loyalty. Elite units and noble retinues wore mail coats and helmets and wielded swords, lances, and shields. The Franks demonstrated tactical flexibility, using siege engines and fortified positions in civil wars, while focusing on mobility and rapid strikes in internal campaigns. Their naval capabilities, while less emphasized, were significant, particularly against Danish incursions. The Merovingians also incorporated soldiers from conquered regions, like Saxons and Wends, who brought their own weapons and fighting styles, forging a diverse and versatile military force.
Baldwin IV, the Leper King of Jerusalem. From the forests of Gaul, we traveled to the sun-baked crusader states of the 12th century, to the story of a king whose courage was matched only by his suffering. Born in the middle of 1161, Baldwin was the son of Amalric, Count of Jaffa and Ascalon, and Agnes of Courtenay. At his christening, his uncle, King Baldwin III, humorously bestowed upon him the grand gift of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a gesture reflecting how unlikely his ascent seemed at the time. But fate had other plans. When King Baldwin III died childless in 1163, Amalric was propelled closer to the throne, though the nobility, suspicious of Agnes, forced him to annul his marriage on dubious grounds of consanguinity. Despite this, Amalric secured the legitimacy of his children, Sibylla and the young Baldwin. Baldwin's childhood was marked by absence. His mother remarried and drifted away, and his sister was sent to a convent. His father's new wife, Maria Comnene, was ambitious and rightly saw the young prince as a hurdle to her own children's prospects. Amid these family complexities, Baldwin was educated in the martial and cultural skills befitting a noble, tutored by the renowned cleric William of Tyre. Under William's guidance, the prince displayed unusual stoicism and a keen mind, despite a mysterious ailment that rendered his right arm insensate. The shadow of leprosy loomed large. Upon Amalric's untimely death from dysentery in 1174, the high court of Jerusalem gathered to ponder succession. Whispers about the young prince's health circulated, fueled by the royal physician's suspicions. The kingdom faced a dire lack of male heirs. After 3 days of intense deliberation, the high court arrived at a consensus. The young Baldwin, despite the looming shadow of his illness, was named king. This decision came with an implicit understanding. A suitable husband would be found for his sister Sibylla to secure the succession. On July 15, 1776, 2 years after his coronation, Baldwin IV officially took the reins of the kingdom, ending Raymond's regency. He appointed his maternal uncle, Jocelyn of Courtenay, as seneschal, signaling a strategic shift in policy, especially towards the arising Egyptian ruler, Saladin. Under Baldwin's leadership, a proactive stance replaced Raymond's cautious diplomacy. He rejected a peace treaty with Saladin, believing the Sultan's expanding influence posed a threat. The young king demonstrated remarkable personal courage and tactical acumen, despite his physical limitations. He led raids near Damascus and intervened in Saladin's conflict with the assassins in the Bekaa Valley. His reign was a constant struggle to balance military aggression with diplomatic necessity, all while his own body was failing him. In 1177, with Frankish forces spread thin, Saladin saw an opening to advance. Baldwin, still recovering from malaria, displayed an indomitable spirit. His initial defensive maneuver at Ascalon led to an unexpected counterattack at the Battle of Montgisard, where Baldwin, leading from the front, achieved a stunning victory against a numerically superior enemy. But the challenges continued. His decision to build the castle of Chastelet, despite previous agreements, showed a pragmatic approach to security. Skirmishes and sieges, like the one at Le Chastelet in 1179, tested his military acumen and physical resilience. The loss of key figures like Humphrey II of Toron and his own worsening condition underscored the harsh realities of his leadership. As his health deteriorated to the point of blindness and immobility, Baldwin faced the question of succession. His choice of his brother-in-law, Guy of Lusignan, as regent proved disastrous. Guy's military incompetence led to a breakdown in cooperation from the kingdom's powerful lords and military orders. In a dramatic confrontation, a physically weakened but still determined Baldwin was denied entry to Ascalon by Guy, showcasing the intense personal and political strife gripping the kingdom. Baldwin eventually removed Guy from the regency and had his young nephew, also named Baldwin, crowned as co-king. In his final months, faced with this complex challenge, he made a decision that would once have seemed unthinkable. He appointed his old rival, Raymond of Tripoli, as regent for his nephew. It was a final act of meticulous planning for the kingdom's future, even as he stared death in the face. Baldwin IV died in early 1185, a king defined by remarkable resilience in the face of personal agony and a kingdom under constant threat. He was laid to rest in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. His death ushered in a brief, chaotic period that ended with the disastrous Battle of Hattin in 1187 and the loss of Jerusalem to Saladin. While some historians have blamed the discord of his final years for the catastrophe, it is critical to recognize that under Baldwin's direct leadership, the Kingdom of Jerusalem maintained its territorial integrity, experienced economic growth, and was held together by a king whose courage, honor, and deep commitment to his realm turned him into a compelling, tragic legend of medieval kingship. The Teutonic Order, from hospital to empire. Our next story begins not in a royal court, but in a field hospital outside the besieged city of Acre in 1190. German merchants from Bremen and Lübeck, inspired by the suffering of their countrymen, established a makeshift hospital during the Third Crusade. This humble act of charity laid the foundation for one of history's most formidable military orders, the Teutonic Knights. The roots of the order go a bit further. In the mid-12th century, under Pope Callistus II's directive, the Knights Hospitallers took charge of a German hospital in Jerusalem, a sanctuary for German pilgrims who couldn't speak the local or Latin languages. While it operated under the Hospitallers, the Pope decreed it be led by Germans, planting the seed for a German-led religious institution in the Holy Land. After Jerusalem fell to Saladin in 1187, the merchants from Lübeck and Bremen established their field hospital during the siege of Acre in 1190. This nucleus was recognized by Pope Clement III in 1192, and by 1198 the group had evolved into a military order, with a Grand Master tasked with crusading to reclaim and protect Jerusalem. Under the leadership of Grand Master Hermann von Salza, 1210 to 1239, the order flourished. They acquired Montfort Castle in 1220, which became their Grand Master's headquarters. Their reach extended across the Holy Roman Empire, bolstered by land donations. Von Salza's relationship with Emperor Frederick II elevated his status, making him a prince of the empire. Despite their prestige, the Teutonic Knights never quite matched the influence of the Templars or Hospitallers in the Crusader states. In 1211, a pivotal moment occurred when King Andrew II of Hungary invited the Teutonic Knights to Transylvania to help defend his southeastern frontier against the Cumans. They were granted the district of Burzenland with unprecedented privileges. Under a knight named Theodoric, they built numerous forts and introduced German settlers. However, their aggressive expansion and fortifications sparked jealousy among the Hungarian nobility and clergy. When the knights, uncertain of their future under Prince Bela, sought to place themselves directly under papal authority in 1224, the move backfired. King Andrew expelled them in 1225, leaving the region vulnerable to subsequent Cuman incursions. The ethnic German settlers they brought, however, were allowed to stay, becoming part of the Transylvanian Saxon community. Finding a new purpose, the order turned to northeastern Poland. In 1226, Duke Conrad I of Masovia sought their help to secure his borders against the pagan Old Prussians. He offered the Chelmo land as a base. Grand Master Hermann von Salza saw this as an opportunity to hone his knight skills for the Holy Land. The Golden Bull of Rimini, issued by Emperor Frederick II, granted the order special imperial rights over Prussia. The campaign to subject Prussia unfolded over 50 years, marked by intense violence and fierce resistance from the native Prussians, who executed captured knights in brutal rituals. The conquest eventually led to the formal submission of some Prussian nobles, but repeated uprisings led to the displacement or resettlement of much of the native population. The imposition of Christianity was met with mixed responses, and the Teutonic rulers found it easier to manage a populace allowed to retain some pagan traditions in a Christianized form. After decades of warfare, the Prussian population was largely stripped of its native inhabitants, fundamentally altering the region's demographic and cultural landscape forever.
The order governed Prussia as a monastic state, promoting immigration from across the Holy Roman Empire and facilitating a gradual Germanization of the surviving Old Prussians. They constructed numerous castles to quell uprisings and support confrontations with neighbors like Lithuania and Poland. Major towns like Torun, Helmno, Królewicz, Königsberg, and Gdansk, Danzig, were established on the ruins of former Prussian settlements, symbolizing the order's dominion and the imposition of a new Christian order. After their expulsion from Hungary and the fall of Acre in 1291, the knights needed a new focus. They found it close by, the pagan Grand Duchy of Lithuania. This conflict drew knights from across Western Europe for seasonal campaigns. The warfare was extraordinarily brutal, lasting over 200 years. In the early 13th century, the order became embroiled in a dispute over Pomerania, Gdansk, Pomerania. Duke Vladislav I of Poland sought their aid to expel the Brandenburgers from Gdansk. In 1308, the knights, led by Heinrich von Plotzka,
expelled the Brandenburgers, but then retained the city for themselves. The subsequent Treaty of Soldin, 1309, saw them secure claims to Gdansk from Brandenburg, solidifying a land bridge between their monastic state and the Holy Roman Empire. This act intensified the enmity between the order and Poland. In the mid-14th century, the order reached the zenith of its power. They conquered the island of Gotland in 1398, securing the Baltic Sea for merchant trade. However, the political landscape shifted dramatically in 1386. The Grand Duke Jogaila of Lithuania converted to Christianity, married the Polish queen Jadwiga, and became King Władysław II Jagiełło of Poland. This created a personal union that presented a formidable challenge to the order, as the crusading pretext for their expansionist policies was now undermined. The pivotal moment came in 1410 at the Battle of Grunwald. A united Polish-Lithuanian force delivered a crushing defeat to the order. Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen and most of the order's top officials fell on the battlefield, shattering the myth of their invincibility. The subsequent Peace of Thorn, 1411, allowed the order to maintain its territories, but its reputation was forever tarnished. The order faced declining influence, internal discord, and financial strain. A series of wars and treaties, including the Peace of Melno, 1422, further diminished their power. Internal strife boiled over in 1440 with the formation of the Prussian Confederation, which began an open rebellion against the order in 1454 and sought annexation by the Polish crown. The ensuing 13 Years' War, 1454 to 1466, ravaged Prussia. The Second Peace of Thorn, 1466, ended the war, with the order ceding significant territories to Poland and agreeing to become a Polish fief. Grand Masters were now required to pledge allegiance to the Polish king, fundamentally altering their position in the region. The final decline came in 1525. Grand Master Albert of Brandenburg converted to Lutheranism, secularized the order's Prussian holdings, and became the Duke of Prussia, a vassal of the Polish crown. This effectively ended the order's rule over Prussian lands. The order refocused on its dwindling possessions within the Holy Roman Empire. Its storied military tradition faced its end in 1805, and by 1810, Napoleon Bonaparte ordered the dissolution of the order's remaining territories. This marked the definitive end of the Teutonic Knights as a territorial power, transitioning them from a formidable military and monastic force into a chapter of European history.
The East-West Schism, the Great Divorce of Christendom. The year 1054 is often cited as the date of the Great Schism, the permanent division between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. However, the roots of this split extend far back in history, centuries before the mutual excommunications that crystallized the separation. Some scholars argue the divergence began long before the 11th century, with the Photian schism in the 9th century being a major waypoint. Others trace tensions back to the 4th century, or even to the 2nd century, with early disputes over papal primacy involving Popes Victor I, Stephen I, and Damasus I. One theory suggests the transfer of the imperial capital from Rome to Constantinople in the 6th century shifted the center of power and prestige, a view later supported by Patriarch Photios. The Church of Constantinople, as the seat of the emperor, claimed a right to govern other patriarchs. Theological and political disputes proliferated during the 4th century as emperors sought to control the Church. By the 5th century, as Western imperial power waned, the influence of the Pope in Rome grew, blurring the lines between secular and ecclesiastical authority. While bishops in the East recognized a certain leadership of the Bishop of Rome due to the city's status as the former capital, they did not view him as infallible or acknowledge absolute judicial authority over them. The Quartodecimanic controversy in the 2nd century over the date of Easter is an early example of this tension. When Bishop Victor of Rome attempted to excommunicate churches in Asia for following their own tradition, he faced resistance from Eastern bishops like Polycrates of Ephesus and was forced to reconsider. Rome's claim to special authority was rooted in its connection to the apostles Peter and Paul. After the sack of Rome by the Goths in 410 AD, the city entered a period of decline and isolation, becoming increasingly irrelevant to the wider Mediterranean Church. This suited many Eastern patriarchs. The First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, 325 AD, affirmed the authority of the metropolitan sees of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. But as the political center shifted to Constantinople, the status of its bishop rose. The Council of Constantinople, 381 AD, elevated the See of Constantinople to a position ahead of all others except Rome. This sparked a rivalry between Constantinople and Rome, fueled by Alexandria's objections to Constantinople's promotion. The Council of Chalcedon, 451 AD, further solidified Constantinople's jurisdiction over the provinces of Pontus and Thrace, causing Pope Leo I to reject Canon 28 of the Council, which he felt infringed on the rights of Alexandria and Antioch. The linguistic and cultural divide between the Latin West and the Greek East only exacerbated these tensions. The decline of proficiency in both languages made communication increasingly difficult, leading to different approaches to religious doctrines and the development of distinctive rites. The conquests of Muslim Arabs in the 7th century significantly impacted the patriarchates of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. In 732 AD, Emperor Leo III transferred territories from the jurisdiction of the Pope to that of the Patriarch of Constantinople as punishment for the Pope's opposition to iconoclasm. The Quinisext Council of 692 AD highlighted the growing divergence as the West rejected its decisions. This led to pressure from the Eastern Empire for the West to abandon certain Latin customs, like celebrating weekday Mass during Lent, fasting on Saturdays, and using unleavened bread.
The major break occurred in 863 AD over the deposition of Patriarch Ignatius of Constantinople and his replacement by the layman Photius. Pope Nicholas I held a synod that reversed the decisions and deposed Photius. The East viewed this as an intrusion, and in response, Photius convened a council in 867 AD that deposed Pope Nicholas I, condemned the Filioque Clause, the Western addition to the Creed, stating the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, and excommunicated him. Although this particular schism was healed, the underlying wounds remained. Leading up to 1054, relations were relatively positive. The defeat of Pope Leo IX at the Battle of Civitate in 1053 strained things. Meanwhile, Patriarch Michael I of Constantinople was criticizing Western practices, like the use of unleavened bread. Pope Leo IX sent a letter to the Patriarch, citing the forged donation of Constantine to claim papal primacy. The Patriarch rejected this. The situation escalated when Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida arrived in Constantinople as a papal legate. His reception was hostile, and he stormed out of the palace. When Pope Leo IX died later that month, the legates continued to assert their authority despite their mandate technically ending. Frustrated, on July 16, 1054, Cardinal Humbert entered the Hagia Sophia during the Divine Liturgy and placed a charter of excommunication on the altar, directed at Patriarch Michael and his followers. The charter listed 11 accusations. 2 days later, they left the city. Patriarch Michael retaliated by holding a synod on July 20, 1054, which excommunicated the legates in return. However, these mutual excommunications did not immediately lead to a complete and irreversible schism. The charter targeted only specific individuals, not the entire Byzantine Church. The dispute could potentially have been resolved, and many ordinary Christians remained blissfully unaware of any substantial change. The sense of separation was not deeply felt for years to come. Efforts at reconciliation were made by subsequent popes and patriarchs, but various factors and historical developments over time only contributed to a widening of the chasm, creating the permanent division we recognize today. Vlad the Impaler, hero, tyrant, and legend. From the division of an empire, we turn to the dark legend of a single man, Vlad III, known as Vlad the Impaler or Vlad Dracula. A significant figure in Wallachian, modern-day Romania, history. He served as voivode, prince, 3 times between 1448 and his death in 1777. Born between 1428 and 1431, he was the second legitimate son of Vlad II Dracul, who himself was an illegitimate son of Mircea I of Wallachia. Vlad II earned the moniker Dracul, Dragon, for his membership in the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order dedicated to defending Christendom against the Ottoman Empire. Vlad III's early life was shaped by the volatile politics of the region. In 1442, his father refused to support an Ottoman invasion of Transylvania and was summoned to demonstrate loyalty to Sultan Murad II. He brought his sons, Vlad and Radu, who were subsequently imprisoned as hostages to ensure his father's continued loyalty. They remained in the fortress of Egrigos, where their lives were in danger after his father supported a Christian crusade against the Ottomans. The experience left a deep mark on the young Vlad, fostering a deep-seated hatred for the Ottomans.
After Rurik's death, his kinsman Oleg moved south, captured Kyiv in 882 AD, and declared it the mother of Rus cities. Oleg shifted the political center from Novgorod to Kyiv and began subjugating neighboring Slavic tribes, imposing tribute and challenging Khazar dominance. The prosperity of the Kyivan state was built on its control over major trade routes. The most famous was the route from the Varangians to the Greeks, connecting the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and on to Constantinople. Another route connected the Baltic to the Caspian Sea and the rich markets of Central Asia and the Middle East via the Volga River. Goods like furs, beeswax, honey, and slaves flowed through these networks, enriching the Rus state and funding its expansion. Oleg's successors, particularly Igor and his wife Olga, continued to consolidate power. Olga, who ruled as regent for her young son Sviatoslav after Igor's death in 445 AD, was notable for her fierce revenge against the Drevlians who murdered her husband, and for her later conversion to Christianity. Her son, Sviatoslav I, ruled 963 to 972, was a quintessential Viking warrior prince. He spent his brief reign on constant military campaigns, shattering the Khazar Khaganate, expanding Rus control into the Pontic steppe, and even clashing with the Byzantine Empire in the Balkans. However, his lack of interest in administration and his failure to establish a stable succession led to a devastating civil war among his sons after his death in 972. The victor of that civil war was Vladimir the Great, ruled 980 to 1015. Vladimir's most transformative act was the Christianization of Kyivan Rus. According to the primary chronicle, he sent envoys to observe the major religions. They were reportedly repulsed by Islam's prohibition of alcohol, unimpressed by German Catholicism, but utterly awestruck by the beauty and splendor of the divine liturgy in the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. They reported, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth." Vladimir decided to adopt Eastern Christianity from the Byzantine Empire. He was baptized in 988 AD, married the Byzantine princess Anna, and ordered the mass baptism of the people of Kyiv in the Dnieper River. This conversion aligned Kyivan Rus with the powerful Byzantine Empire, provided a state ideology and written script, Cyrillic, for Slavic languages, and profoundly shaped the cultural and religious identity of the region for centuries to come. Vladimir's son, Yaroslav the Wise, ruled 1019 to 1054, presided over the golden age of Kyivan Rus. He strengthened the state through strategic dynastic marriages, marrying off his daughters and sisters to the kings of France, Hungary, Norway, and the Holy Roman Empire. He promulgated the first East Slavic law code, the Ruskaya Pravda, Russian justice. He built the magnificent St. Sophia Cathedral in Kyiv and its namesake in Novgorod, monumental symbols of the state's power and its new Christian faith. He fostered education and the monastic life, leading to the development of the Kyivan Caves Monastery. Yaroslav's reign, however, also sowed the seeds of future decline. The complex succession system, where power rotated among the senior members of the sprawling Rurikid dynasty, instead of passing directly from father to son, led to pervasive family conflict and incessant civil wars. After Yaroslav's death, his descendants battled for control of the various principalities. The powerful regional centers of Novgorod, Vladimir Suzdal, Halich, and Volhynia increasingly asserted their autonomy from Kyiv. A crushing defeat at the hands of the Cumans, a nomadic Turkic people, in 1068 further weakened central authority. The final blow came from the Mongols. In 1240, Batu Khan's Mongol armies sacked and destroyed Kyiv, the mother of Rus cities. The invasion decimated the population and shattered the already fragmented political structure of Kyivan Rus. While the Principality of Halich-Volhynia in the southwest would survive for another century before falling to Poland and Lithuania, it was in the northeast, in the principalities of Vladimir Suzdal and later Moscow, that the political and cultural legacy of Kyivan Rus would be reborn, eventually forming the nucleus of a new Russian state.
Our final story takes us back to the world of the Vikings, to the tale of a warrior king who embodied the end of an era. Harold Sigurdsson, better known as Harold Hardrada, Hard Ruler, was born in 1015 in Norway. He was the half-brother of King Olaf II Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf. As a young man, Harold fought alongside Olaf in the disastrous Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, where Olaf was killed trying to reclaim the Norwegian throne from the Danish ruler Canute the Great. Wounded, Harold fled into exile. His exile took him east, first to the court of Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise in Kyivan Rus, where he served as a captain. But his ambition drew him further south, to the fabled city of Constantinople. Around 1034, Harold arrived with his 500-man retinue and joined the Varangian Guard, the elite personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor. The Varangian Guard was composed primarily of Norsemen and Anglo-Saxons, renowned for their loyalty and ferocity. Harold's career in Byzantine service was legendary. He fought pirates in the Mediterranean, campaigned in Asia Minor and Mesopotamia, and may have even traveled to Jerusalem. He proved his leadership and valor in numerous battles. A major campaign was the Byzantine effort to reclaim Sicily from the Saracens in 1038, where he fought alongside Norman mercenaries like William Ironarm. He was known for his cunning and his ruthlessness, earning the nickname Bulgar Burner for his brutal suppression of a revolt in Bulgaria. He rose through the ranks of the Guard, but also amassed a vast personal fortune through a combination of pay, plunder, and the Byzantine custom of polutasvarf, plundering the imperial palace upon the death of an emperor. After falling out of favor with Empress Zoe, Harold was imprisoned. He managed a daring escape, fleeing Constantinople with 2 ships and sailing back to the Black Sea, having sent his immense wealth to Yaroslav in Kyivan Rus for safekeeping. Back in Kyivan Rus, he married Yaroslav's daughter, Elizabeth, and in 1045 he set sail for Norway to claim the throne. He was a threat to the young King Magnus the Good, his nephew and the son of Saint Olaf. Instead of fighting, they reached a compromise. They would co-rule Norway. This arrangement lasted until Magnus's sudden death in 1047, at which point Harald became the sole king of Norway. Harald spent the next 15 years trying to fulfill his ambition of recreating Canute the Great's North Sea Empire. His primary target was Denmark, ruled by King Sweyn II Estridsson. From 1048 to 1064, Harald launched near-annual raids against the Danish coast, sacking important trading hubs like Hedeby. The conflict culminated in a major naval battle at Nisa in 1062, which was indecisive. Exhausted, both kings finally agreed to an unconditional peace in 1064. Harald had failed to conquer Denmark. At home, Harald was a harsh but effective ruler. He consolidated royal power by breaking the influence of the powerful regional chieftains, imposed strict taxation, and ruthlessly crushed any opposition, earning him his epithet. He also completed the Christianization of Norway, built churches, and introduced a national coinage, fostering trade and a stronger economy. In 1066, a new opportunity arose. Harald Hardrada received a claim to the English throne based on a dubious agreement between his predecessor, Magnus, and the previous English king, Harold Godwinson. In September 66, Harald launched his invasion with his fleet of some 300 ships, landing in northern England. The invaders defeated the local English earls Edwin and Morcar at the Battle of Fulford near York on September 20th, 1066. The city surrendered to Harald. But just as he was celebrating, King Harald was marching north with a formidable army. On September 25th, 1066, Godwinson caught the Norwegians completely by surprise at Stamford Bridge.
The Norwegian army was caught without its armor. Despite a heroic last stand by a single giant Norseman on the bridge, the English forces overwhelmed them. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking, was struck in the throat by an arrow and fell. He died a berserker's death, fighting without his armor in the thick of the fray. His army was annihilated. So many men fell that the battlefield was said to have been bleached white with bones for decades afterward. The victory at Stamford Bridge was a stunning triumph for Harold Godwinson, but it came at a terrible price. His army was exhausted and depleted. Just 3 days later, he received news that a second invasion force, led by William, Duke of Normandy, had landed in the south. The exhausted English army marched south, and on October 14th, 1066, they met their fate at the Battle of Hastings. The Viking Age, which had begun at Lindisfarne in 793, effectively ended on that bloody field in Yorkshire with the death of King Harald Hardrada, the last of the great Viking warrior kings. Canute the Great, architect of the North Sea Empire. Before we conclude, let us briefly revisit the man who created the empire Harald Hardrada had sought to rebuild. Canute the Great, also known as Canute, was a Viking ruler who, by the early 11th century, forged a vast North Sea empire encompassing Denmark, England, Norway, and parts of Sweden. He was the son of Sweyn Forkbeard, the Danish king who conquered England in 1013, and a Polish princess, Świętoslawa. After Sweyn's sudden death in 1014,
the English nobles recalled the exiled king Ethelred the Unready, forcing Canute to flee back to Denmark. He returned in 1015 with a massive invasion fleet, determined to claim his inheritance. Over the next 14 months, Canute waged a brutal and relentless war against Ethelred's son, the heroic Edmund Ironside. After a series of pitched battles, the final decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Assanden in October 1066. Canute was victorious, and a peace treaty was agreed that divided the country. However, Edmund Ironside died a few weeks later, and Canute became the undisputed king of all England. As king, Canute proved to be a wise and effective ruler. He executed several English nobles he viewed as threats, but he also wisely married Ethelred's widow, Emma of Normandy, to solidify his link to the old English line. He sent his large army home, retaining a smaller, more efficient force of 40 ships, and financed his rule through an annual land tax, the Heregeld. He divided England into 4 large earldoms, initially placing them under Danish control, but over time he integrated English nobles into the highest offices. He wrote a famous letter from Denmark in 1019, promising to be a gracious lord and a faithful observer of God's law and just secular law. He worked to ensure coexistence between Danish and English legal systems, a region known as the Danelaw. After consolidating England, Canute secured his hold on Denmark, then marched on Norway. In 1028, he sailed into Trondheim Fjord with a massive fleet, and the Norwegian nobles, thoroughly bribed, proclaimed him king. He placed the region under the rule of his trusted lieutenant, Earl Håkon Eriksson. Only Sweden, under King Anund Jacob, remained independent, and Canute spent years raiding its coasts. Canute was also a devout Christian, despite his pagan upbringing. He generously patronized churches and monasteries in England, sent missionaries to Scandinavia, and made a grand pilgrimage to Rome in 1027 to attend the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II. He negotiated with the Pope for reduced fees for English archbishops and for the safety of English pilgrims traveling to Rome. His interactions with Conrad II placed him on equal footing with the great European rulers, solidifying his status as a major Christian king. Canute the Great died in 1035. His North Sea Empire was a testament to his exceptional leadership, military skill, and political acumen. But it was a personal empire, built on his own prestige and ability. Within a decade of his death, it had fallen apart, undone by disputed successions and the inability of his heirs to command the same loyalty. Nevertheless, for a brief, shining moment, a Dane sat on the throne of England, commanded the loyalty of Norwegian warriors, and was hailed as a leader among the kings of Europe. He was, in many ways, the last great ruler of a united Viking world, an architect of an empire that, while fleeting, left an indelible mark on the history of Northern Europe. The Kingdom of the Suebi, forging a Germanic realm in Iberia. Our journey ends where it began, with a Germanic tribe carving out a kingdom in the ruins of Rome. The Suebi, who crossed the Rhine into Roman territory in 406 AD, remains somewhat of a mystery. They may have been synonymous with the Quadi, a tribe from north of the Danube. Their crossing was likely triggered by the expansion of the Huns, which displaced other Germanic groups. After initial containment by the usurper Constantine III in Gaul, the Vandals, Alans, and Suebi
crossed the Pyrenees into Hispania in 410 AD, taking advantage of a civil war that had left the mountain passes undefended. For 2 years, they plunged the peninsula into chaos. By 411 AD, a semblance of peace was negotiated. The Suebi, led by King Heremar, were allotted the far northwestern province of Gallicasia, modern Galicia, Spain, and northern Portugal. They settled peacefully, with some sources describing them as transitioning from warriors to farmers. Their capital became the city of Bracara Augusta, modern Braga, Portugal.
Hermeric spent the next decades consolidating Suebic power in Galatia, leading to conflicts with the native Galacii. In 438 AD, suffering from failing health, he abdicated in favor of his son, Dracula. Dracula proved to be a far more aggressive ruler. He launched a series of spectacular campaigns, exploiting the weakening grip of the Roman Empire. In 439 AD, he captured the great city of Merida, the capital of Lusitania, which temporarily served as his capital. He then seized Seville, bringing the provinces of Baetica and Carthaginensis under Suebic control. His reign marked the high tide of Suebic expansion. When the Romans finally dispatched an army in 446 AD, Dracula met and decisively defeated it, ending Roman attempts to reclaim Hispania for good. Dracula died in 448 AD and was succeeded by his son Riciar. Riciar was a trailblazer. He was the first Germanic king to convert to Catholic Christianity rather than Arianism. He was also an ambitious conqueror, leading devastating campaigns across the peninsula, but he overreached. The Roman Emperor Avitus allied with the Visigothic king Theodoric II, who invaded Galatia in 456 AD. The Visigoths decisively defeated the Suebi at the Battle of the River Orbigo, capturing and later executing King Riciar. The kingdom was thrown into chaos. The Suebi, a relatively small group, faded into the local Galatian Roman population over the following generations. Their name was lost, their language absorbed, and their distinct identity vanished from the historical record. But they left a lasting, if subtle, legacy. Their kingdom was one of the first independent Germanic polities to be carved out of Roman territory, a precursor to the much larger and more powerful Visigothic kingdom that would dominate Iberia for the next 2 centuries. Their early and unique conversion to Catholicism rather than Arianism set them apart from their Gothic rivals and demonstrated that the relationship between Germanic rulers, their Roman subjects, and the Church was complex and varied. The Suebi serve as a vital reminder that the fall of the Western Roman Empire was not a single catastrophic event, but a long, slow, and complex mosaic of migrations, settlements, alliances, betrayals, and the often violent birth of new kingdoms. They are a testament to the dynamic and unpredictable nature of the early Middle Ages, a period where the map of Europe was being redrawn by ambitious warlords and migrating peoples, each seeking their own place in the shadow of a fallen giant. Charlemagne, Forging an Empire, a detailed biography. We now return to the most famous of all Frankish rulers, a man whose name became synonymous with an entire era. Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, ruled as King of the Franks from 768 AD and later as Emperor of the Carolingian Empire until his death in 814 AD.
His expansive military campaigns, his complex relationship with the papacy, and his administrative and cultural reforms fundamentally reshaped the political and intellectual landscape of the West. By the 6th century, the Franks, a Western Germanic tribe, had already embraced Catholicism, largely due to the conversion of their king, Clovis I. Following the collapse of Western Roman power, they established the Kingdom of Francia in Gaul. This kingdom, ruled by the Merovingian dynasty, often experienced division due to Frankish practice of partibal inheritance, dividing lands among all surviving sons. By the late 7th century, internal turmoil had severely weakened the Merovingian kings, who became known as the rois fainéants, do-nothing kings. Real power passed to the mayor of the palace, the chief officer of the royal household. In 687, Pepin of Aristal, the mayor of the palace of Austrasia, the Eastern Kingdom, reunited the Frankish realms after his victory at the Battle of Tertry. His son Charles Martel continued this consolidation, famously defeating a massive Umayyad army at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, halting the northern advance of Islam from Spain. After Charles Martel's death, power passed to his sons, Carloman and Pepin the Short. In 751 AD, Pepin the Short, with the approval of the Pope, deposed the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, and had himself crowned king. This established the Carolingian dynasty, named after Pepin's father, Charles Martel, or Carolus being Latin for Charles. Charlemagne was the eldest son of Pepin the Short and his wife Bertrada of Leon. His exact date of birth is uncertain, but modern historians generally accept April 2, 748 AD. He likely grew up bilingual, speaking both a Germanic dialect, Old Franken, and a Romance precursor to Old French. Although details of his formal education are murky, he was a patron of learning who valued the liberal arts, even if he himself may have only learned to read late in life and never mastered writing, preferring to dictate his decrees. His early life was spent on campaign with his father, learning the brutal trade of a Frankish warlord.
Upon Pepin's death in 768, Charlemagne and his younger brother, Carloman, inherited the kingdom as joint rulers. The relationship was tense, marked by rivalry and suspicion. However, Carloman's sudden death in 771 left Charlemagne as the sole, undisputed king of the Franks. He acted immediately to secure his power, forcing Carloman's widow and children to flee to the court of the Lombard king Desiderius, and then divorcing his own Lombard wife, Desiderata. He quickly married a new wife, Hildegard, to cement an alliance with a powerful Frankish noble family. Charlemagne's first major campaign as sole king was against the Saxons to the east. The Saxons, a pagan and fiercely independent confederation, had long raided the Frankish borders. In 772, Charlemagne destroyed their main shrine, the Irminsul, seizing a vast treasure. This act of aggression began a brutal 30-year war of conquest and forced conversion that would define much of his reign. The Saxons would rebel again and again, led by the wily chieftain Wiedekind, and Charlemagne would respond with overwhelming force and shocking cruelty. In 782, after a Saxon rebellion had annihilated a Frankish army, Charlemagne ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners in a single day, an event known as the Massacre of Verdun.
He issued the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae, a harsh legal code that mandated conversion to Christianity under penalty of death. War, massacre, deportation, and forced baptism, these were the tools Charlemagne used to break the Saxons. It was a dark, genocidal chapter in his reign. In the middle of the Saxon Wars, Charlemagne was drawn into Italy. Pope Adrian I, threatened by the Lombard king Desiderius, appealed to the Frankish king for aid. In 773, Charlemagne crossed the Alps with a massive army, bypassing Lombard fortifications and besieging their capital, Pavia. The siege lasted through the winter until disease-weakened Pavia surrendered in June 774. Charlemagne did not simply restore the pope's lands. He deposed Desiderius, sent him to a monastery, and had himself crowned king of the Lombards. For the first time, a Frankish ruler was also a king in Italy. After settling affairs in Italy, Charlemagne returned to the grim business of the Saxon War. For over a decade, he led near-annual campaigns, building fortresses, taking hostages, and enforcing baptisms. He also expanded his horizons. In 778, he led an expedition into Muslim Spain, answering a call for help from the governor of Barcelona. The campaign was a failure, and during the retreat, the rearguard of his army was ambushed by Basque tribesmen in the mountain pass of Roncesvalles. This event, though a minor military setback, would be immortalized centuries later in the French epic poem, The Song of Roland. The following decades saw Charlemagne at the height of his power. He conquered Bavaria, deposing his own cousin, Duke Tassilo III. He waged a multi-year campaign against the nomadic Avars of the Hungarian plain, destroying their main fortress, known as the Ring, and carting off an immense amount of gold and silver. By the early 790s, the Saxon resistance had finally been crushed, and Wiedekind himself had submitted and been baptized. Charlemagne's kingdom now stretched from the Atlantic to the Elbe River and from the North Sea to central Italy. Increasingly, Charlemagne ruled from his new capital at Aachen, Aix-la-Chapelle, where he built a magnificent palace complex, including a stunning Palatine chapel. He surrounded himself with Europe's leading scholars, including the Northumbrian Alcuin, the Visigoth Theodulf, and the Frank Einhard, his future biographer. This gathering of intellectuals became known as the Carolingian Renaissance. They worked to reform education, standardize Latin, copy and preserve classical and Christian manuscripts, and develop a new, clear handwriting known as Carolingian minuscule, which is the direct ancestor of modern lowercase print. The goal was to create a learned clergy capable of administering the vast realm and spreading correct Christian doctrine. The defining moment of Charlemagne's reign came on Christmas Day in the year 800 A.D. He had traveled to Rome to protect a politically weak pope, Pope Leo III, who had been attacked by his own enemies. On Christmas Day, as Charlemagne knelt in prayer in St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo III unexpectedly placed a golden crown on his head and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. The crowd supposedly shouted, "Long life and victory to Charles the Great, the pious Augustus, crowned by God." Charlemagne, according to his biographer Einhard, was initially surprised and claimed he would not have entered the church if he had known it was going to happen. Historians debate this. Was it a genuine surprise or a cleverly staged political theater? Regardless, the act was revolutionary. The Roman Empire in the West, which had been defunct since the abdication of the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus in 476 AD, was reborn. This naturally infuriated the legitimate Roman emperor in Constantinople, who saw Charlemagne as a usurper. The coronation also locked the Frankish king and the pope into a powerful but often fraught alliance. The emperor was supposed to protect the pope, and the pope was supposed to anoint the emperor, creating a theoretical model for a unified Christendom.
The last decade of Charlemagne's life was quieter. He crowned his only surviving legitimate son, Louis the Pious, as co-emperor in 813 AD. His succession plans were thrown into disarray by the deaths of his two elder sons, Pepin and Charles. He faced new threats, including Viking raids on the northern coasts. In 810, a Danish fleet ravaged Frisia. He organized coastal defenses, but never faced a major Viking army himself. That task would fall to his successors. On January 28, 814 AD, Charlemagne died at Aachen after a week-long illness, likely of pleurisy. He was in his early 70s, a great age for a 9th century warlord. He was buried in the Palatine chapel he had built. His body was interred sitting on a throne, dressed in his finest robes, with a golden scepter in one hand and a copy of the Gospels in the other. Charlemagne's legacy is monumental. He forged a vast, unified empire from the disparate pieces of post-Roman Europe. He revived the idea of a Western Empire, a concept that would shape European politics for the next 1,000 years, leading to the creation of the Holy Roman Empire. The political and cultural structures he established, the counts, the missi dominici, royal agents who oversaw local administration, the palace school, the scriptoria, created a model for medieval government. The Carolingian Renaissance preserved the literary heritage of both Rome and the early Church. He transformed the Frankish kingdom from a rough, warrior society into a Christian imperium. He is a figure of colossal contradictions. A devoted son of the Church who built monasteries and abhorred heresy, yet also a ruthless conqueror who massacred thousands of pagan Saxons. He was a man who treasured learning and surrounded himself with scholars, yet he could barely write his own name. He was, for better and worse, the architect of medieval Europe. Martin Luther, the reluctant revolutionary. We now leap forward 7 centuries from the construction of a unified Christendom to its greatest fracture. Martin Luther was not a king or a warrior, but his weapon was a quill, and his battlefield was the human soul. A German monk, a theologian, and a professor, his challenge to the Catholic Church in 1517 sparked the Protestant Reformation, a religious and political upheaval that shattered the religious unity of Western Europe and changed the world. Luther was born on November 10, 1483, in Eisleben in the Holy Roman Empire. His father, Hans Luther, was a successful copper miner who worked hard to provide his son with an excellent education. Hans wanted Martin to become a lawyer. Young Martin studied at the University of Erfurt, earning a Master's of Arts degree in 1505. He was a diligent, intelligent, and deeply introspective student. But a sudden violent thunderstorm in 1505 changed the course of his life. A lightning bolt struck the ground near him, and the terrified young man cried out, "Help me, Saint Anne, I will become a monk." He survived,
and to his father's immense disappointment, he kept his vow, entering the Augustinian monastery at Erfurt. Luther threw himself into the monastic life with a furious, desperate intensity. He prayed, fasted, confessed for hours on end, and performed every act of penance he could. He later described this period as one of profound spiritual crisis. He was consumed by a terrifying sense of his own sinfulness and an image of God as a wrathful, punitive judge. No matter how much he performed good works, he could not find peace or the certainty of salvation. His wise superior, Johann von Staupitz, hoping to distract him from his obsessive introspection, ordered him into an academic career. Luther earned his doctorate in theology in 1512 and became a professor at the new University of Wittenberg. As he lectured on the Psalms and the letters of St. Paul, especially his epistle to the Romans, Luther experienced a theological breakthrough. The key was the concept of the righteousness of God. Traditionally, this was understood as the active, demanding justice of God, the standard of moral perfection that humans, in their sinfulness, could never meet, and for which they would be justly condemned. But Luther began to see it differently. The righteousness of God was not a demand, but a gift. It was a righteousness that God gives to the believer through faith in Jesus Christ. As he later wrote, "I felt that I was altogether born again and entered paradise itself through open gates." The core doctrine of the Reformation was born: sola fide, justification by faith alone. Salvation is not earned by good works, but is a free gift of God's grace, received through faith in Christ. This new understanding soon brought Luther into direct conflict with the Church. The immediate catalyst was the sale of indulgences. An indulgence was a way to reduce the temporal punishment in purgatory for sins that had already been forgiven. In the late Middle Ages, they had become a highly profitable fundraising tool. In 1516, Pope Leo X needed money to finance the completion of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. He authorized a special indulgence in Germany, half of which would be used to repay a massive debt owed by the young Archbishop Albert of Mainz. He hired the charismatic Dominican friar Johann Tetzel to preach the indulgence. Tetzel's sales pitch was aggressive, and he was widely quoted, though likely apocryphally, as saying, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs."
For Luther, this was a theological disaster. It implied that salvation could be bought and sold, that the Church had power over purgatory and even over God's judgment, and it encouraged people to rely on a transaction instead of genuine repentance and faith in Christ. On October 31, 1517, Luther wrote a letter to Archbishop Albert, enclosing a list of 95 theological theses for debate. He was not trying to start a revolution. He was a dutiful professor raising points for an academic disputation. He also took the unprecedented step of sending the theses to friends and colleagues. Within weeks, the 95 theses had been translated from Latin into German, printed on the new Gutenberg press, and spread like wildfire across Germany. His nuanced academic arguments were lost. The central message that the Pope's indulgences were a sham was not. Luther had unwittingly become a celebrity and a focal point for German discontent with Rome. The Church's response was slow, but then became brutally direct. Luther was ordered to Rome for a heresy trial.
He was defended by his territorial ruler, the powerful Elector Frederick the Wise of Saxony, who arranged for Luther to be examined in the city of Augsburg. At a debate in Leipzig in 1519, Luther went further than ever before, arguing that popes and church councils could err, and that the ultimate authority for a Christian was the Bible alone, sola scriptura. He was now a declared heretic. Pope Leo X issued a papal bull, a formal decree, in June 1520, giving Luther 60 days to recant 41 specific errors or be excommunicated. Luther publicly burned the papal bull, along with books of canon law, in front of a cheering crowd of students and professors at Wittenberg. Excommunication followed in January 1521. But Luther was not just a monk, he was a subject of the Holy Roman Empire. The new emperor, the young and devout Catholic Charles V, was determined to stamp out heresy. Luther was summoned to the imperial diet, assembly, in the city of Worms in April 1521. He was shown a table of his writings and asked if they were his and if he would recant them. He admitted they were. He then famously asked for a day to think. The next day, he gave his final answer. In a long, defiant speech, he stated that unless he was convinced by the testimony of the Scriptures or by clear reason, since popes and councils had often erred, he could not and would not recant. "Here I stand," he reportedly said. "I can do no other. God help me. Amen." Charles V declared Luther an outlaw, making it legal for anyone to kill him. To save his life, Frederick the Wise had Luther kidnapped on his way home from Worms and hidden away in the Wartburg castle. He grew a beard, took the name Knight George, and spent a year in hiding. It was one of the most productive periods of his life. He wrote dozens of theological pamphlets, and most importantly, he translated the New Testament from the original Greek into a powerful, earthy, and accessible German language. This translation was a masterpiece of literature and a revolutionary act. For the first time, ordinary Germans, not just priests and scholars, could read the Word of God for themselves. When Luther emerged from the Wartburg in 1522, he found that the movement he had unleashed was spiraling out of control. Radical reformers in Wittenberg were smashing statues and altars and inciting social unrest. Luther returned and through a series of powerful sermons reasserted a more moderate, controlled pace of reform. But the genie was out of the bottle. The Peasants' War erupted in 1524-1525 as trodden-down peasants, inspired by Luther's language of Christian freedom, rose up against their noble lords. Luther had some sympathy for the peasants' grievances, but he was horrified by their violent rebellion against the God-ordained authorities, a view based on his reading of St. Paul's epistle to the Romans. He wrote a fiery pamphlet against the murderous, thieving hordes of peasants, urging the nobles to crush the revolt. Tens of thousands of peasants were slaughtered. The peasants felt betrayed, and Luther's movement became more dependent on the support of princes and city magistrates. In 1525, Luther did something else that scandalized the Catholic world. He married. His wife was Catherine of Bora, a former nun he had helped escape from her convent. He had been part of a plan to smuggle a dozen nuns out in empty herring barrels. Over the years, he found a wife for all of them except Catherine. he eventually married her himself. Their marriage, while loving and happy, was a powerful symbolic rejection of the Catholic clerical vow of celibacy. They had 6 children, and their home, the Black Cloister in Wittenberg, became a bustling household and a model for the Protestant parsonage. The rest of Luther's life was devoted to organizing the new church. He wrote 2 catechisms, a large one for pastors and a small one for families, to teach the basics of the Christian faith. He composed dozens of hymns, including the famous "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," making music a central part of Protestant worship. He worked with his colleague Philip Melanchthon to draft the Augsburg Confession 1530, the definitive statement of the Lutheran faith. He also continued to publish pamphlets and tracts, and his language grew increasingly coarse and violent, especially against his theological enemies, the Pope, the enthusiastic radicals, and, most notoriously, the Jews.
Luther's later writings on the Jews are a dark stain on his legacy. In his early career, he had written a sympathetic pamphlet that Jesus Christ was a Jew, arguing that the Church had treated the Jews poorly. But when they refused to convert to his brand of Reformed Christianity, his attitude curdled into hatred. In his 1543 book, On the Jews and Their Lies, he advocated a vicious program of destruction and persecution, burning synagogues and Jewish schools, destroying Jewish homes, confiscating their money and books, forbidding their rabbis to teach, and forcing them into manual labor or expelling them from the country. These writings were used by Nazi propagandists in the 1930s and remain a source of deep and difficult reckoning for the Lutheran churches today. Luther's health declined in his final decade. He suffered from kidney stones, arthritis, heart problems, and a host of other ailments. He continued to work, travel, and write, but he was often in severe pain and prone to fits of anger and depression. In January 1546, he traveled to his hometown of Eisleben to mediate a dispute. The mediation was successful, but his health finally gave out. He died in the early hours of February 18, 1546. He was buried in the Castle Church in Wittenberg, the same church whose door he had supposedly nailed his 95 Theses nearly 30 years earlier. Martin Luther was a complex, flawed, and towering figure. He was a brilliant theologian, a master of the German language, a loving father, and a courageous reformer. He was also a stubborn, often rabid controversialist who could spew venomous hatred at his enemies. He did not set out to destroy the Catholic Church. He only wanted to reform it. But in his relentless pursuit of a gracious God, he shattered the 1,000-year-old unity of Western Christendom, creating a new religious landscape of war, schism, and ultimately the freedom of individual conscience. He remains one of the most influential figures in Western history, a revolutionary whose name is synonymous with the very idea of protest and reform. The death of Martin Luther in 1546 did not mark the end of the religious wars that his protests had helped to ignite. Instead, it signaled a new, more violent, and more political phase. The fragile Peace of Augsburg, 1555, which had attempted to settle religious divisions within the Holy Roman Empire,
by establishing the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion, was already showing its deep flaws. It only recognized Lutheranism and Catholicism, completely ignoring the rapidly spreading Reformed tradition of John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli. The next century would be defined by a series of devastating religious conflicts, culminating in the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, a brutal continent-wide struggle that reduced vast swaths of Germany to rubble and left millions dead. The Peace of Westphalia that finally ended the war redrew the map of Europe, cemented the rise of sovereign nation-states, and definitively ended the dream of a unified, Pope-led Christendom. The world was becoming recognizably modern, fragmented, politically driven, and defined by the balance of power rather than a single overarching spiritual authority. The Kingdom of the Suebi, a deeper look at conversion and collapse. Let us return for a moment to the Iberian Peninsula in the 5th century to better understand the unique path of the Suebi. Their conversion from paganism to Christianity and then from Arianism to Catholicism was not a single event, but a slow, politically charged process. Early Suebic kings were pagan. The first to convert to Christianity was Rechiar, Recihiar, king from 448 to 456, famously adopted Nicene Catholic Christianity, likely as a political move to align himself with the powerful Catholic Hispano-Roman elite of his newly conquered territories. This was a remarkable deviation from the Arianism adopted by the Visigoths, Vandals, and other Germanic peoples. This religious difference made the Suebi a natural ally for the local Roman population, but a direct enemy of the Arian Visigoths. After the Visigothic conquest and the chaotic decades that followed, the Suebic kingdom was re-established, but it had largely converted to Arian Christianity, probably under Visigothic influence. The critical figure in the final conversion of the Suebi to Catholicism was not a king, but a missionary, Saint Martin of Braga, c. 520 to 580. Born in Pannonia, Martin traveled to the Holy Land and then to Iberia, where he became a monk, then abbot, then bishop of Dumio, and finally archbishop of Braga. He was a prolific writer, theologian, and reformer. He fought against paganism, especially the worship of natural springs and idols, rooted out Priscillianist heresies, and tirelessly preached Catholic orthodoxy to the Suebic nobility. His work was so successful that at the First Council of Braga, c. 561, the Suebic king Ariamir publicly professed the Catholic faith.
His legal and administrative reforms in England were particularly lasting. He had grown up in a violent, conquered land and wanted stability. He realized that continued Viking-style plunder was bad for business. He therefore paid off and sent home most of his massive invasion fleet, keeping a much smaller, professional, and loyal force. He levied an annual land tax, the Heergeld, to pay for this standing army and navy. He enforced the laws of King Edgar, a pre-conquest English king, as the common legal standard, blending Anglo-Saxon and Danish traditions. This created a unified legal framework that helped reconcile the English and Danish populations. He issued charters and writs in English, not just Latin or Danish,
signaling respect for English custom. He built churches and monasteries, gave generously to the local clergy, and undertook a pilgrimage to Rome in 1027 that was part spiritual act, part political summit. While there, he negotiated for lower fees for English archbishops receiving their papal pallium, a symbol of office, and secured safer passage for English pilgrims traveling to Rome. He was, for all intents and purposes, a very successful and well-regarded English king who happened to be Danish by birth. Canute's North Sea Empire was the last great Viking superpower. It was a personal union, held together not by a robust federal system, but by the prestige, wealth, and military power of a single man. He ruled through trusted deputies, his brother-in-law, Earl Ulf in Denmark, his nephew, Earl Hakon in Norway, and a mix of English and Danish earls in England. The cracks appeared immediately after his death. His sons, Harold Harefoot in England and Harthacnut in Denmark, were less capable and could not command the same loyalty. Norway slipped away under the leadership of the recovered native king, Magnus the Good. By 1042, the male line of Canute was dead, and the English throne was taken by Edward the Confessor, the exiled son of the old Anglo-Saxon king, Athelred the Unready. The empire dissolved as quickly as it was created. It was a spectacular, fleeting moment, a testament to one man's extraordinary ability, but a demonstration of the structural weakness of purely personal, conquest-based empires. Harald Hardrada, the last Viking's final campaign. We can add one final poignant detail to the death of Harald Hardrada. The story, as told in the Heimskringla, the saga of the Norwegian kings, written by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, claims that on the eve of the Battle of Stamford Bridge, a lone English horseman rode up to the Norwegian army. He spoke to Harold and Tostig, offering peace and the restoration of Tostig's earldom if they would withdraw. When Tostig asked what the English king Harold Godwinson would offer Harald Hardrada of Norway, the horseman famously replied, 7 feet of English ground, or as much more as he is taller than other men. The horseman then turned and rode away. Tostig later told Harold that the horseman was almost certainly Harold Godwinson himself. Whether the story is true or not, it perfectly captures the unyielding spirit of the age. It was not a war that could be settled by compromise. It was a war for a throne, and the only settlement was death on the battlefield. And what a battlefield it was! The Norwegian army was not expecting a fight. It was a warm day, and most of the men had left their heavy mail armor back on the ships. They were caught completely by surprise. The initial English assault was driven back, but the English held the bridge. The stand of the single axe-wielding Norseman on the bridge is a classic heroic moment from the sagas. According to the story, he killed dozens of Englishmen single-handedly until an English soldier floated under the bridge in a half-barrel and thrust a spear upward through the slats, mortally wounding him. Once the bridge was crossed, the English flooded over. King Harald Hardrada, a berserker in his youth, fought like a man possessed. He did not wear a coat of mail, wielding his two-handed sword with both hands, hacking through the English ranks until an arrow found his throat. His death broke the Norwegian will. The late arrival of reinforcements from the ships only added to the slaughter. The great Viking invasion was over. The army that was supposed to conquer England was annihilated. So many men died that the battlefield was said to have been white with bleached bones for decades. Harold Godwinson's victory was total, but it was also the beginning of his own end. Baldwin IV, the legacy of a leper king. The tragic and heroic reign of Baldwin IV left a vacuum that was filled by disaster, but his personal story continues to resonate. He was a king who was literally rotting away while trying to hold his kingdom together. Leprosy in the 12th century was a terrifying and highly stigmatized disease. Lepers were often considered dead in the eyes of the law, forced to live in separate colonies, wear distinctive bells or clappers, and were ritually shunned. Yet Baldwin was an anointed king. The contradiction was staggering. To see your king, God's chosen representative on earth, visibly decaying from a disease seen as a punishment for sin, was a profound spiritual and psychological crisis for the kingdom. Yet Baldwin fought on. He wore gloves and long sleeves to hide his disfigurement. He had a specially designed saddle that allowed him to fight despite his atrophied limbs. He led charges, attended council meetings, and dictated policies even as he lost his fingers, his toes, and eventually his sight.